Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Design Diaries, where I'm going to be talking you guys through the process of how I create some of my artworks. For the previous episode, I showed you guys my Lumipede kebab stall, which is a fantastical food stall that I created for an art challenge that I run here with my local art community. So what is the art challenge, you may ask? Well, it's called Design Jam, and the goal of it is to try to be creative within limitations. So you're going to try to come up with a unique design out of 1 to 3 references. So if you want to follow along, here are the references on the screen, and I'm going to show you how I use those references to create this, which is a fantastical food cart design, which I call the yak kebab cart. So without further ado, let's just jump straight into the video, guys. So one of the main ideas that I had when I was starting off this design challenge was to take the architecture, which I really like the design language of from Ref 3, and trying to turn it into a food cart design that the yak from Ref 1 would be pulling, and having the cooking implements influenced by the steampunk elements that you see in reference 2. So as you saw earlier, I tried to do a sketch in perspective, but I did find that it was very difficult for me to try and resolve the design language while on top of that drawing in perspective. So whenever you're feeling like you're stuck, just try to switch to an orthographic sketch, which is kind of like side on or front on. Because in reality, a 3D design is made of multiple angles, right? So if you can make one angle look good, you can be assured that at the very least you have one side that looks nice, and you just have to resolve it later on for all of the rest. And for the first sketch, I wasn't too happy with how I lost the design language from the church reference. So in my second one, I tried to do it from the front, where I felt like it was looking a lot closer to the ref. However, I wasn't so happy with how the gas canisters on the side were looking and how it was connecting to the cart. And in fact, I felt like I was losing out on the design language of the second reference. So in order to tackle that, I decided to isolate the problem, where I just designed the cart with just the church reference in mind, and later on, which you can see me doing now, trying to implement the design language of the steampunk on top of the church design language. And you can even see that I changed up the materials despite keeping the same design language, and that's something that you can always do with these kinds of challenges. Just because the reference is telling you that this is an architecture ref made out of stone, bricks, and all of that, doesn't mean that you can't change it to a different material for it to suit your needs. So after feeling satisfied with the design of the cart and the yak as well, I decided to put both of them together. And of course, when you're putting two things together, it's rarely going to be done and dusted just like that. You want to make sure to figure out how they all kind of fit in together. And I realized when I was working on this that I had very little knowledge on how a wagon and a cart functions or how it's constructed. And on top of that as well, while I know that a lot of beasts of burdens pull carts, I don't know how all of the harnesses and all of that attach from the animal to the cart. So I decided to do a little bit of deeper research later on, which you'll see me doing very soon. But at this stage, I'm kind of trying to just push this sketch a little bit further, adding in colors, pushing the materials, in order to get an idea if this design would work out once I bring it to a more finished level. So here you can see me adding in a little bit of weathering, and also trying to resolve how the stove would actually connect a little bit better. And one of the things that you see on the side there is that I had the idea that if this cart was actually functioning, then you would have to have a cover, right? So that the grilled meat is not going to get contaminated and get exposed to the elements. So it's something that I thought you could use as a cover, but then there's going to be these extendable legs at the bottom that allow it to doubly function as a chopping table, or a table where you chop up vegetables and ingredients. So here you can see me putting in a lot of different references that I found in Pinterest, in Google. So sometimes that's the design process. You're gonna find as you're working on a design, there's going to be certain problems that you didn't foresee and that you need a lot more information in order to solve. So people sometimes have the mistaken notion that whenever you're finding reference, it's a done and dusted thing. You can't go back and find new ones. But design is a very organic process. If you feel like you need extra reference, definitely pull more in. And in fact, I wouldn't worry too much even sometimes about finding too much reference. However, one of the biggest issues is that we tend to spend too much time doing it, right? So my solution to that is try to time yourself, know exactly what you're looking out for, and later on, once you're actually doing the integration of the reference, then you can start to cull it and reduce the amount of references that you have. So as you can see, I finally found some references on how the yak connects to the cart, and even some references on how a wagon is constructed. And if you're ever feeling stuck on what keywords to use, it's a good idea to even type things such as diagram or schematics, because then there is going to be a lot of information out there that will give you specific terms, that will tell you what each part is named. And from there, you can then Google very specific results as well, rather than Google or whatever search engine that you're using giving you very broad and vague results. And also one thing that I found to be very helpful when I was designing this wagon and cart was to actually type in the keywords model or even toy. Because when you're designing for those things, it has to be quite simplified, right? You can't overwhelm it with the same level of details as the real thing has. And in fact, they kind of boil it down to a very core functionality and then just build around that. Because in reality, I'm not trying to make the world's most convincing or even most functional cart. For the most part, when I design, I just try and make it believable enough that the layperson, when they look at it, they feel like there's no confusion what the functionality is. And it feels like, okay, you know what? That's convincing enough for me. And of course, you're always going to get people that are experts that are saying like, actually, that's not how it works. But of course, you can't please everyone. But as long as you can get a general suspension of disbelief, that'll be good enough. So after having done the 2D sketch and being happy with where it is, I decided to put it up in my reference board and my pure ref, which you've been seeing on the top left so far. Hopefully you guys also get a better idea of where I'm looking at for solutions and how often I look through my references to actually find solutions as well. So let me know if you guys have been finding that to be helpful. And in general, when going into 3D, I'm trying to just keep it simple. 3D is not a means to an end for me. It's just for it to resolve specific problems that I think 3D is good at. So for me, I believe that 3D is great at resolving the sense of space, perspective, lighting accuracy, and of course being able to design or resolve your design from multiple angles. And of course, every medium has its pros and cons, but I do believe that even if you're a 2D artist, being able to design in 3D and having that in your tool set can really speed up your workflow. And it's even more efficient and effective when you have to do your design in multiple angles. Initially, I was planning to do that for this concept, but I did realize that I didn't have as much time to flesh everything out as I wanted to. But with that said, it still gave me a very solid base for me to work off of later. So even with the types of shapes that I'm designing, you'll notice that I'm not getting down and dirty with all of the small details. I'm just keeping it to large and medium shapes. And the really nice thing about designing in 3D, as I mentioned, is that you can look at it from multiple angles. So it's kind of like playing with Legos, right? You can see it from multiple angles. You can take certain parts, make it smaller, scale it up, and duplicate it, and put it all around your design. Oh, well, of course, real Lego can't do that, but just going back to my main point, you can turn it around and make sure that your design looks good from every angle. Because sometimes if you're working exclusively in 2D, you might not have that luxury, and just because something looks good from one angle, you might find that, oh, it kind of looks pretty bad from another one. Here, you're able to get a holistic view on your design and making sure that you don't get any weird tangents and all the shapes are going to be dynamic, or at the very least, they're not going to be so even and then diluting the rest of the design. And I made a tutorial on that as well, where I explain what I mean by all of this in order to create shape designs that feel more dynamic. So I'll link it somewhere in the video for you guys to check out. And of course, doesn't mean that you can't use 3D as a tool for designing as well. You can see that I've decided to turn the cart around here and add in a shelf that wasn't in my original sketch. So in this part, I was thinking that, oh, well, if this was a truly functioning cart, then there would have to be storage space, right? For all of the ingredients or maybe all of the utensils and just things to aid in the operation of this cart. So I decided to take a little bit of time to flesh that out. But like I said, unfortunately, I wasn't able to put it in the final concept. And after having done a design that I was quite happy with in 3D, or at least solid base, I bring it back into 2D again. But this isn't where I'm finishing things off. The goal of this paint over is to just, in a sense, give you a roadmap on what you need to do to finish. Because sometimes, and I'm sure if you've used 3D as well, you will know this exact issue, is that you tend to have the tendency to want to over detail things. You tend to want to do too much, making sure that everything looks perfect or sometimes even modeled very cleanly. But that's besides the point. Once again, you have to know why you're using 3D. And for me, is to just have enough of a solid base to resolve for perspective, even a bit of lighting and colors, and a sense of space, making sure that everything fits as it should, and even resolving things such as scale before I bring it into 2D. So in this stage, I'm trying to do things such as adding in some materials and small details that I couldn't do very quickly in 3D. And just to test whether I'm heading in the right direction and what else that I need in order to make it a finished concept. So after establishing this roadmap and even goals, so to speak, I'm gonna now bring it back to 3D and model out some of those details. But once again, just keeping it to the medium shapes and maybe even some very small and maybe possibly complex shapes. But other than that, keeping it simple. So now that I've taken a little bit of time in my 2D paint over just now to try and resolve how this undercarriage looks like and how it functions, now it's much easier for me to kind of like flip the cart around, try and really resolve the functionality in much more detail. And over here you can see me designing, I don't know what you call it, but it's the part that attaches to the yak. And very soon you're also going to see me model out the yak. And when it comes to modeling some things out, I actually don't want it to be so detailed, because if I was to do a properly detailed yak, well, first of all, I don't have the skills, but on top of that, really organic things tends to be more challenging for me, and I'm not familiar with the sculpting workflow. So all that I'm doing is putting in a placeholder yak so that I know just how much space that it will occupy in the final concept later on. And one thing I didn't really mention earlier as well is that it's really important for you to put a human scale in your model as well, or next to your model, so you can figure out if everything is to scale. So for example, making sure that it's not too tall or too big, but on top of that as well, realizing that maybe some of the handles or things that humans would interact with are not too thick, or even when you're designing stairs, that it's not too tall. These are some things we kind of take for granted. So having a scale model really helps with that. And of course, the really nice thing about 3D, even if it is off scale, you can just minimize it. Whereas in 2D, you can of course scale things down, but then you have to paint over more things as well. So you can do those changes much quicker in 3D. And even doing the spokes of the wheels as well was much easier for me to do in 3D and quickly rather than in 2D. So this is something that comes with experience. You'll know what will be faster in 2D and 3D. and you'll know what kind of needs that you have for your own project or for your own workflow. So experiment with it. Sometimes maybe even try a workflow where you're mostly in 3D, or a workflow where you're mostly in 2D. And from there, you'll be able to figure things out. So now that I've already established the concept, I found the right angle, which is just slightly around eye level, just to make it feel more immersive, like you're in the scene. I'm now going to paint things over officially, trying to bring it to a finish. So what's my goal when I'm doing this? So I think that one of the most difficult parts about integrating 3D into your 2D workflow is actually doing something very counterintuitive, and that is to actually destroy some of the perfection in 3D and then building it back up. Because my goal, at least when I'm painting over 3D, is to break down that stiffness that 3D has, and even the perfection. 3D is great at telling you just how the light falls and how the shadows look like, and giving you very clean forms, assuming you modeled it that way. However, those are the things that make things feel very stiff and dead. So there's a couple of things that I try to do in order to break that. So one of the first approaches that I have is breaking up the silhouette. So instead of having everything with straight edges, I try to give everything a little bit of a sag, a bit of a distortion, and just adding nicks and knacks to the silhouette. You can see that I'm trying to break all of those straight lines and trying to make things feel a little bit wonky and therefore a little bit more worn, and something that feels like it has a lot more character to it. And you can see the wheels here as well. They're a little bit faceted. They're not purely round. So these are the kinds of things that I'm trying to do to make it feel a little bit more lively. But also, when it comes down to the colors, you'll notice that 3D render gives you a lot of gradients. However, assuming that the surface that you're creating is a little bit warped, it's going to be very rarely clean gradient from one end to another. You're going to get some parts that maybe have a little bit of a dent to it, or maybe a little bit more raised. So you can see me adding very visible brush strokes in order to indicate that. And basically breaking up a clean surface with large, medium, small strokes in order to make it feel like it was all hand painted. And another thing that you can do to make it feel a little bit less stiff and a little bit more lively is to add weathering. And where I would like to put weathering is generally thinking about the scene or the object and thinking about where people would most likely interact with it. So it's generally going to be edges and corners. These are the places that maybe even if you're walking past a table, oops, you might bump into it, or you're carrying a crate, you might create a scratch somewhere. And I decided to put a lot more weathering on the kitchen counter in front of the kebab grill, because that's probably where a lot of the construction of the doner kebabs are happening, or maybe the grazing of a lot of utensils and equipment, and even the stove as well. Like I said, maybe it has encountered a lot of wear and tear through heavy objects hitting it. And even with cloth as well, maybe you want some slight loose threads. And even with the metal, especially the wheels where they touch the ground, you're going to add in a little bit more scratches and nicks and knacks to it as well. And another thing that you can do is to simplify. Like I said, it might feel very counterintuitive, or in fact, you might feel very precious about breaking things that have been so perfectly calculated for you by 3D. However, the goal, once again, you have to ask yourself that, is what is my main goal? Or it's also about readability, where I'm trying to de-emphasize the things that aren't important, but then emphasizing the things that are important. So areas around the grill, the stove, I'm trying to add in more speculars, more highlights in order to make it feel brighter, to contrast against the darker shadows. But then the areas that aren't as important, like the undercarriage or the further wheel of the undercarriage, I try to make it almost pitch black. And don't be afraid to do that, because if you're drawing attention to where it's not important, it's going to make it much more difficult to have a pleasing read. And at this stage, since I'm feeling quite happy with where the rendering is going for the cart, I decide to take a step back, take off my rendering cap, and put on my designing cap. Because I think it's very easy for us to stay stuck in one thing. And with my designing cap, I decided to think about how the kebab assembly station would look like. What kind of equipment would be there? What kind of ingredients, for example? I probably could have done this earlier. And I think that line work is a really great way, and even writing things down for you to get into that designer mindset. So take a step back every once in a while, especially if you're feeling stuck, or even just timing yourself every couple of hours to just take a break, have a look at your piece and ask yourself, is it fulfilling all the things that I wanted to in the first place? And of course, it's time for us to tackle the beast of this piece, which is the yak. And as you guys know, I'm not much of a creature designer. The funny thing is I probably spent as much time on this yak as I did with the cart, or maybe with every single part of the concept. And there's a couple of reasons why, looking back. And one of the main reasons is that, as you can see, the level of finish for this yak right now is so far behind with the cart that I was really doubting where it was going for a very long time. And in hindsight, I think I could have worked on it in tandem, so I feel like there wouldn't be this much of a gap in between, and therefore I would be more assured knowing that, oh yeah, it's both heading in the right direction. But because of the big gap in between it, I felt quite anxious for the most part, wondering that would this even work out at all? So that's another key piece of advice for you guys. If possible, try and work on your piece holistically rather than leaving some things up until later. But second of all is that I'm not very great at rendering fur and designing creatures and with their anatomy and all of that. And at this point, my good friend Matthias Osland gave me really great advice on how to render fur. And that is to try and think about things as clumps, especially with the stylization that I'm doing. And he told me as well to pull in references of works that you think match that style. And because the cart in itself was meant to have a little bit more of a Riot and Blizzard stylization where it's a bit chunky, I felt like I should have treated the fur the same way. Whereas when I was painting it, I tried to make it a little bit too bristly and a little bit too much details. And being frustrated with the yak, I decided to take a little bit of a break and just rendering some salad, some of the utensils and some of the tools that I did line work for earlier. And you can see with the plate, I decided to do it white as well for it to stand out against the darker values. And I really enjoy painting food, honestly. There's so many interesting and pretty colors about it. And you can see me very soon also adding in the design language of the church as the patterns on the plate. So you can always do subtle design motifs such as this as well. And of course, I'm trying to draw upon my foodie experience on what it would take to make this kebab grill station a functional place. So thinking about, okay, you need the salad to put in, you're gonna need a shelf to hold the bread and the basket as well. And then also the garlic sauce, which is my favorite part of eating a doner kebab, and making sure that there's heaping spoonfuls that the owner can put in it. And of course, a stool in order for the owner to be able to reach the grilled meat as well, because I do realize that there's quite a gap and a height difference. And here's another part of the piece where it was very regrettable for me. And I'm sure you guys can relate with me when I say that sometimes you feel like you're so frustrated with a piece that it feels like it's a lot better for you to just restart completely. And sometimes that's okay, especially if you have the time. But especially with your client work, you're not gonna have the luxury to be able to do so. So me feeling quite bold, I decided to try to do everything from scratch again for the yak, or at least the fur. But I realized that after a certain amount of time that, hang on, I'm really wasting time here. Why don't I just take what I've already had before, then just build off of that? And of course, as I mentioned before, going back into a line work stage to fix fundamentals such as anatomy and then the flow of the fur, the things that I neglected early on. it really helped me out. And honestly, I'm quite happy with how the fur turned out, considering that I don't have much experience rendering it, and even with creature designs in general, I think I've really learned a lot from that process. And of course, now that I've already rendered the yak to a much more finished level, it's time to go back to the cart and making sure that everything is up to the same level. So with finishing touches, I try to push the materials a bit more. I try to make sure that the lighting from the grill is connecting to the objects so it doesn't feel like the objects are floating or not existing in the same space. Adding in some ambient light that I already put in the yak onto the cart itself, once again to make it feel like they're sitting in the same environment. And of course, adding in some last minute functional details such as this chain that would prevent the wheel from turning too far. Adding in smoke to make it feel like it's a living, breathing machine right now that's in operation and functional. And of course, just adding in a few finishing touches with like the small shapes, speculars, highlights, weathering, and all of that. And honestly, at some point I was even telling myself, I really regret doing a piece that's fully painted and this rendered. I didn't intend on being that way, but here's another thing about 3D, because it sets the standard so high in terms of the level of finish and the benchmark, it's hard not to want to match that, right? So either you really destroy it and bring it down to low fidelity so you don't have to finish it as high, or you kind of just follow along. However, I'm glad that I did it because I realized that I've improved so much more. The last time that I fully painted a piece was probably like 6 years ago, and I'm very proud to say that all of the hard work that I put into painting has really paid off. And you can even consider me as someone that, well, I would have never thought I would say this, that enjoys rendering. And right now, I'm just adding in some last minute personalization and branding with the yak sign. And I thought about the name of Blue Yak, at least in the back of my head. And I do notice that I tend to do a lot of concepts that are teal in color. You'll notice that with the Lumipede kebab and even with the signage being blue as well. Call me biased, but hey, those are the colors that I like. And what's funny is that if I had $1 for every kebab-based concept that I've ever done, I'd have $2 to $3, which I know isn't much, but hey, that's much more than what most people can say, right? And here it is in all of its glory, the Blue Yak Kebab cart. And this one has been a real doozy. I've decided to try out a few things such as adding the ref window and of course even doing this piece in Photoshop to try and speed up the workflow and to push the piece even further. However, it was a bit unfortunate that I had a couple of things happening along the way, such as a big move. Well, I wouldn't say it's so big, but it definitely took out 2 weeks of my time. And then even having my PC brick as well, and having to freshly install Windows and having a housewarming party and just a lot of events happening at once. However, I'm glad that I'm able to just settle back in and just get back into the swing of things as well. I've got a lot of big things coming up for you guys. I've got a lot of big ideas, so stay tuned for that, guys. Speaking of bigger news, I've decided to open up the monthly design challenge to the wider JTuff Designs community. You guys might have seen me make a post about it in the community, but if you'd like to join it, I would love to see what you guys come up with, and you'll have all the details there in the community post, or in fact, I might even put it down in the description box as well. So I'd love to see what you guys come up with for the next one, and even feature some of them on the next video as well. Wouldn't that be awesome? So until the next video, guys, take care, and as always, stay stretchy.